So I would say that the primary religious language, insofar as there is such a thing, it's something I tried to detail in Maps of Meaning, the first book I wrote, a very complicated book. But religious propositions are, in some sense, abstracted generalizations about what being consists of and how to act in it. It's not the same thing as a set of hypotheses about material reality. And it's partly because in the religious domain, the moral imperative is primary, whereas in the empirical domain, the factual domain is primary, or the sensory domain is primary, something like that. So the question from the religious perspective is something like, how should we best construe the world if we wish to determine how to act properly within it? And the way that language has developed, it's developed as a consequence of an evolutionary process, both biological and cultural. And it's culminated in a set of stories, essentially, that have characters. The characters basically represent something like the permanently unknowable. And so that's the mystery that surrounds us all. And that would be associated, say, with the potential of the future and the potential in you. The part of being that's transcendent, right, that constantly escapes from your theorizing. That's the unknown. It's like unexplored territory for animals. And it's a permanent part of being. So there's unexplored territory, the unknown, and there's explored territory, culture, the known, and that's this room, and that's the cultural mores that unite us well enough so that we can all sit here and be peaceful while we're discussing difficult things. So that's the landscape, the religious landscape. That's yin and yang. That's chaos and order. Interestingly enough, it looks like it's to that landscape that our brain has adapted, because the right hemisphere looks like it's roughly responsible for processing chaos and the unknown, and the left hemisphere roughly responsible for processing the known and the familiar. And that's on good evidence. If you don't want to take my word for it, you can read Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, which is quite masterful treatment of the neuropsychological literature. And so that's the religious domain, yin and yang, chaos and order. And it places human beings at the center of that. And the idea is that we're always confronted by what we understand and have to adapt to that, even in its tyrannical manifestation. And we're always faced with the permanent reality of the permanently incomprehensible that can burst into our life at any moment and disrupt it. That's reality. And then the religious question is, if that's reality, how do you orient yourself in relationship to those two permanent domains? And the answer to that is something like, pursue the instinct of meaning. Because it looks like meaning is the instinctive response, neuropsychologically grounded in the orienting reflex, I would say, which is a very primordial reflex to the unknown. Meaning is the response that orients us in that world. And so when we're engaged in a meaningful enterprise, it's a signal from the deepest elements of our biological being that we have the balance between what we know and makes us secure and what we don't know and have yet to explore properly sync. And that makes us secure, but not totalitarian, and engaged, but not terrified. And by staying on that midpoint of balance, that's Tao, by the way, that's the way from the Taoist perspective. By staying on that midpoint, we do what's best for us, what's best for our families, what's best for our community, and God only knows beyond that. We do all of that simultaneously, and we can tell that we're doing that. It speaks to us when we're doing that. And that's the deepest of religious instincts. And it's that capability to orient on that border between chaos and order that's exemplified in great mythological heroes like St. George, who goes out to slay the dragon, or Christ, who welcomes death, who embraces mortality and vulnerability and strives forward nonetheless. And There's nothing outside of the religious language that communicates that kind of grandeur. There's nothing that you can use to communicate to people who are in the direst of straits what's most important about life in the manner that will help set them straight and put their soul at peace. So that's the advantage of the religious language.
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you both for a very interesting and revealing exchange. My question is for you, Dr. Peterson. You alluded to an important distinction between someone who would actually be an atheist and someone who merely professes to be an atheist. You implied that Matt and others are not genuinely atheists. I'm curious why you think that. Is it just because we have sacred values, that everyone has sacred values? What, in your view, would a genuine atheist be like?
He'd be like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. And I can't really come up with a better answer than that because it's such a complicated question that that's the right answer. You know, I love that book. It's an amazing book, and it's a great thriller, by the way. If there are some of you, perhaps many of you, who haven't read it, you really should read it because it might be the greatest novel ever written. I think you can make a case for that. It's unbelievably exciting once you get into it. And Raskolnikov, he plots the perfect murder. It's so interesting because Dostoevsky, the last thing Dostoevsky ever did was make a straw man out of his opponents, let's say. What Dostoevsky did in all of his great novels was make his enemies, let's say, or make each of the positions that he was trying to contend with as powerful and admirable as he possibly could. And since he was an absolutely spectacular genius, he could really do that. And so Raskolnikov plots a murder. And he murders this horrible woman, who's horrible according to everyone who knows her, who also has enslaved her rather mentally feeble niece, and who does nothing but make people miserable consciously all the time. And he does that in order to save his sister from a rather sophisticated form of prostitution, to save himself from starvation so that he can become a great lawyer and help people. Right? So Dostoevsky sets up the stage. Here is the perfect situation for a murder, and all of the rational choices point in that direction. And Raskolnikov, who's also sort of torturing himself, or sort of tortured because he's sort of hungry and not very well, not thinking very clearly, he undertakes the murder, and he gets away with it. And before he does it, he berates himself in what I would describe as the negative atheistic style. And he basically says, look, there is every rational reason to split this woman's skull with an axe. Look at all the good I would do. Look at all the well-being I would enhance. And so he does it. And then all hell breaks loose. And what Dostoevsky was Raskolnikov built himself up to the murder in part by laying out the rational case, but also by saying, well, there's no God. There's no metaphysical reason that's stopping me from committing this act. And there's all these reasons that appear perfectly rational, pushing me in that direction. Perhaps I'm nothing but a moral coward for failing to undertake it. So he does. But what he finds out is that he broke an inviolable moral rule, something that spoke to his own soul, so to speak. And the rest of the book basically involves his sequential post-traumatic unraveling. And the post-traumatic issue is very interesting because one of the things you do see happening with post-traumatic stress disorder is that it very often occurs in people who watch themselves do something of great malevolence. By their own admission, I'm not projecting this onto them. They've watched themselves they've stepped outside the ancient moral code unwittingly and conducted themselves in a manner they cannot reconcile themselves to, and they are permanently broken. So there are works like that, Crime and Punishment, first and foremost, I would say, that do a lovely job of elucidating in narrative form how these self-evident moral presuppositions are necessarily nested inside this broader narrative metaphorical substrate. and that you use your rationality divorced from that metaphorical substrate at your peril. And I believe that to be the case. I think that's an accurate psychological summation.
Thank you. I'm curious if Matt has any thoughts on the matter.
You think?
I have plenty.
So it's rather surprising, and I promise you I don't mean this to be insulting, because I definitely place you considerably higher than most of the apologists that I've engaged with. But there's a common theme from the apologists, and that is, you're not really an atheist because. Now, in Dr. Peterson's case, it's, you're not really an atheist because, in my mind, an atheist is someone who would be a murderer. And so I'm just, rather than saddle you with that, you just think you're an atheist, but really you're not. From other apologists, it's, you think you're an atheist, but you're not, because God's written his moral code on your heart. This is essentially, as far as I can tell, what was expressed in some way, that there's a moral foundation, a moral center that God has imbued people with, and that we all know this, or we all recognize it, or you're not really an atheist, or this is what an atheist would do. An atheist is somebody who doesn't believe there's a God. I am not convinced there's a God. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm convinced there are no gods, although that is a subset of, hey, I don't believe there's a God, and then there's a subset that is, I believe there are no gods. This is, as I've talked about previously, independent of whether or not I can be a moral being or do good things, is independent from whether or not there's awe and wonder or purpose and meaning in my life. In much the same way that, previously they wanted to kind of say, oh, this is a secular humanist, regime that was just awful. Well, it wasn't secular humanism. There were atheist fans who wrote me that were like, oh man, I can't wait till you do this conversation with Jordan. And I was like, cool. And still, I hope that we have many more conversations as well, because just saying one thing that I find irritating is never going to be enough to get rid of me. But I asked them, great, I'm not that familiar with him. What is it about him that you like, and what are the concerns? And they came back with a bunch of things. None of them said anything about agreeing with views on religion. They seemed very confused on those things. And so the good news for them is that while he thinks atheists would be murderers, he doesn't actually think you're an atheist. And that is his way of getting around acknowledging things that conflict with his worldview. I don't get to decide who is or isn't a true Christian. I didn't even get to decide that when I was a believer. I definitely don't get to do it now. So if somebody tells me they're a Christian, I'm going to have to accept that. I have a model in my head of what that means. I have a model in my head of what it means to be a Muslim, but I'm willing for them to explain to me what their model is. I know people who identify as Christian atheists. They really love the stuff that Jesus said, but they don't actually believe there's God. Thomas Jefferson famously cut out the Jefferson Bible and removed every reference to the supernatural and miracles and things like that because he really admired the teachings of it. And sure, I think you could be a cultural Christian in that if you wanted to. It's strange to me that I'm not sitting here with somebody like Ray Comfort when I'm told you're not really an atheist because you're too good to be an atheist. And this is what atheists hear all the time when they come out. They've been sidelined because of religious privilege around the world for years. And then atheists come out to their family members or friends or people they've known for years, and they're like, you're an atheist? How can that be? You're such a good person. I've known you all this time. It's because the mindset of what people have about what an atheist is has been poisoned by religious proclamations. We have been denigrated from the pulpit, and it has seeped into every aspect of culture, right up to the height of intellectual pursuits. And it's time for that to end.